Well, thank you, first of all, to Jack for that incredible, generous, overwhelming introduction. And of course, thank you for bringing us all together. It's been an amazing workshop already, and I'm really excited for the rest of the day. I also want to thank everyone at the Rietveld Academy, including Jorenda, Jort, and Nikos for all their logistical and practical support. All of that invisible labor is so important, and without it, none of this would have congealed into place. At dawn, the marble tent glowed a soft pinkish gold. Inside, it was cool and dusty. Light from a triangular skylight pierced the curved roof, illuminating the streaked walls. In the distance stood the Parthenon, surrounded by scaffolding and construction cranes, hushed before the workday. Rebecca Belmore's life-size shelter, From the Inside, 2017, situated on a hilltop in Athens, Greece, as a part of Documenta 14, was hand-carved by the studio of Vangelis Ilias. Particular attention was given to the draping of the sculptural tent's fabric and the soft folds around its entrance, recalling the importance of drapery and modeling for ancient Greek statuary. The tent's mouth was positioned so that the visitor, when seated inside the low-ceilinged structure, would be at eye level with the Acropolis. This drew an imaginary thread between these two vastly different architectural forms. And Belmore utilized a suggestive sightline to connect a contemporary emblem of migration, homelessness, and displacement with an iconic symbol of classical heritage. And this is Belmore here, as you can see her seated. Belmore, an interdisciplinary First Nations Anishinaabe artist based in Canada, was not the only contributor whose work in Documenta 14 confronted a global refugee crisis that was especially volatile and visible in the exhibition's two host countries of Germany and Greece. Other examples included Olu Ogwibe's concrete obelisk, Monument for Strangers and Refugees, installed in Kassel's Königsplatz, onto which the welcoming words, "I was a stranger and you took me in," from Matthew chapter 25, verse 35, was incised in multiple languages. Ogwibe's work intentionally references some of the expected conventions of heroic monumentality within a public square in order to point out how migrants, far from being embraced, continue to be rejected, vilified, despised, or ignored. What is usually a mark of triumphant commemoration becomes a first-person plea for compassion and justice, generating friction between its stated message and the usually dominating phallic visual vocabulary of the obelisk. By contrast, Belmore's project offers a counter-monument, modestly scaled and intrinsically interactive, with its implicit invitation to enter a womb-like interior, one that elliptically evoked both the resourcefulness of nomadism and the critical enormity of current conditions of statelessness, with its shape alone, absent of any textual elaboration. As influentially defined by James E. Young some 25 years ago in reference to the proliferation of conceptual Holocaust memorials in Germany, the counter-monument is, quote, aesthetically skeptical of the assumptions underpinning traditional memorial forms, one that humbles itself in the eyes of its beholders. Often created as temporary gestures that can also be fragmentary or self-effacing, on a bodily level, counter-monuments frequently incorporate the public in more intimate modes of address to stress the unresolved nature of memories around national traumas and the need to perpetually restage these crises so they do not fade from collective history. And this is one of Young's preeminent examples, a really famous monument to the memorial to the Holocaust in Harburg, Germany by the Goetzes. And these are just some of the images so you can see the progression. It was a moving, kinetic monument. In some ways it started, as you see, as a kind of classical column, but attached to its base was a stylus, and you could write in the soft lead on the side, so people would write things, including just random graffiti. That was that solicitation to participate or to make marks was an important part of the grammar of the visuality here. And slowly, in increments, it was lowered into the ground until finally it completely disappeared. And it's interesting to think about that in relation to what Jack was talking about in terms of an architecture in a way. Since the early 1990s, when her performance and installation practice first rose to prominence, Belmore's work has repeatedly functioned as a vital counter-monument that confronts the ongoing inequities, hardships, and emergencies faced by Indigenous peoples in Canada and around the world. Hers are also importantly haptic engagements, ones that elicit touch and explicitly invite handling, so that you often feel the work as much as you might see it, imagining, for instance, in this piece, how different this unyielding stone is from the softness of cloth. In the case of From Inside, the material beckons you to literally crawl inside in order to realign the senses in an encounter that is also about gauging relative warmth, noticing the collection of smells and odors, and perceiving how sounds are distorted by virtue of this marble envelope. So in a way, this tent I'm proposing offers a kind of sensorial reckoning along with an optical engagement. And as I said, that sight line, that it directly connects you to the Parthenon is a hugely important part of the piece, but it's not the only part of the piece. So this encounter with a kind of sensorial shape, form, people did touch it and caress it, meant that the visual was not negated by the haptic, but instead was importantly augmented. I want to say, too, that although I can't pronounce it, it's important to me that I'm putting the Anishinaabe title of this piece up, because obviously Belmore's really invested in making that language visible. Belmore sometimes locates her art very far from conventional institutional spaces. For instance, in her piece Vigil from 2002, performed on a street corner in Vancouver, British Columbia, in the downtown East Side, an area known for its large indigent and sex worker population, she paid striking homage to the lives of the many missing and murdered Indigenous women who have disappeared in the last 30 years in Canada. She enacted a series of ritual actions, including washing the street with soapy water, lighting candles, freeing herself violently from a red dress after she nailed it to a telephone pole, calling the names of abducted women, and shredding roses with her teeth. Ceremonies of remembrance often integrate some of these elements, such as the lighting of candles, but by the end of this durational piece, Belmore, yelling names in her underwear, has veered sharply away from these protocols in what could be called a self-conscious counter-ceremony. Yet Belmore's tent in Athens was subject to scrutiny, not because it was too humble, to cite James Young, but rather because it was not humble enough, precisely because of its incorporation of marble, which was, for some critics, an unshakably aggrandizing materiality. Wrote one critic, the tent felt rather like a crypt, and instead of actually evoking the experience of refugees, I saw it as a wasteful object that sought to consecrate the refugee crisis with an expensive monument. So many critics focused on this the marble monumentality of this tent, and really took Belmore to task for it. Rather groan-inducing, concluded another review. Another critic dismissed the tent as quite puzzling and wrote that, quote, its message falls somewhat flat given the context of curator Adam Shimczek's enterprise of splitting the exhibition between two economically unequal countries. For these critics, Belmore's work could not but partake in Documenta's overall suspect project of crisis tourism. At the end of the exhibition's run in Athens, the tent was relocated to Kassel, deposited into place with the use of a crane. Nestled on a grassy lawn in the town's Weinberg Terrassen, its hunched form faced a waste incinerator plant in the distance. So it's a very different spatial configuration when it moved to Germany. No longer looking at the Parthenon, but instead this kind of hilly vista. During its run in these divergent spatial circumstances, someone sarcastically listed it on Airbnb as a cozy marble tent with a cute skylight window, amazing garden, and unique landscape view. A bargain of sorts. It was offered at $19 US a night in both locations. And I don't know, maybe someone in this room knows more about Julia Del Rio, who's the person who posted this. I think she's a Spanish artist. But obviously this is, again, a kind of critical take on how Belmore's tent is sort of overly spectacularizing the refugee crisis precisely because of this cozy marble tent, the use of marble. From inside, as with much of her work, Belmore evinces a deep investment in how materials, in this case, local Greek marble, similar to what was used to construct the Parthenon, are relational partners in an expanded vision of artistic engagement that includes both viewer and object. So against those critics who understood this to be very wasteful or monumentalizing, I want to think about how Belmore carefully considers how objects are made and what they are made of, with thought given to their specific qualities and their agentive capacities to signify and carry stories. For what accountabilities do materials demand or suggest? How can an artist's and an audience's tactile engagements with cloth or wood or clay create alternate histories? Belmore's work, I believe, models some answers to these questions. Within many indigenous worldviews, objects are keepers of memory, and even more than that, are inscribed with or possess an animacy of their own. As Wendy McCoon's Guineas elucidates, things such as rocks, trees, and plants, which are considered to be inanimate by dominant society, are considered animate within Anishinaabe philosophy. Historian of indigenous art Julie Nagam writes about the importance of recognizing the agency of materiality and the powerful understandings of living entities that are at the center of indigenous epistemologies, referring to how a beaded design on a moccasin might be considered both a creation and a creature. She says these objects are similarly perceived as radiating a living presence. Within this conception of the world, marble or any kind of stone, no less than a flower or a cloud, is not inert, but is a substance imbued with its own energy, capable of signifying in ways that exceed any additional meaning by virtue of being shaped by human hands. And because Belmore's marble was Greek, in Athens it held regional connotations that grounded it within that specific landscape. When it was removed from that location and shipped to Kassel, it spoke to the extraction and exportation of resources as they are ripped from a less privileged nation for the benefit of a wealthier one. And here I refer you to Macarena Gomez-Barres' recent beautiful and brilliant book on indigenous resistance to extractivist logics. In their co-authored article, Beyond the Mirror, Indigenous Epistemologies and New Materialisms in Contemporary Art, Jessica Horton and Janet Berlow assert indigenous scholars and scholars of the indigenous will attest to the survival of alternative intellectual traditions in which the liveliness of matter is grasped as quite ordinary, both inside and at the fringes of European modernity. They extend their analysis to discuss Belmore's work Fountain from 2005, which was installed at the Canadian Pavilion of the Venice Biennale, observing that its charged use of blood and water was rooted in very old approaches to materiality that can go overlooked in the recent academic fashion for thing theory, as if such considerations about the mutuality between object and human have only just been invented by intellectuals in the global north. And of course here I've been very inspired by and shaped by Mel White-Chen's brilliant and beautiful work on animacy, which absolutely pays homage to indigenous epistemologies. Curator Candace Hopkins, in her perceptive text on Belmore, writes about the marble tent. The form has its root in other vernacular shelters as well. The shape of the tent is, for me, reminiscent of the wigwam dwellings that are part of my history as an indigenous person. That's Belmore's explanation. Wigwams, traditionally constructed of the bent wood of young trees and covered with birch bark, are a rather ingenious solution for building with the materials available at hand. They also enabled a people who were in constant motion to make their home wherever necessary. So that rather than seeing this material choice of marble as overly grandiose, Hopkins points to Belmore's citation of long histories of provisional, improvised, and nomadic modes of shelter, and to vernacular and indigenous architectures. And Hopkins was on the curatorial team of Documenta, Hopkins herself a First Nations curator, and I believe it's because of her influence that Belmore was not the only indigenous or native artist in this last iteration. In fact, it was one of many native pieces, including tapestries by the Sami needleworker, Britta Marakatlaba, and masks by the Pacific Northwest coast carver Bo Dick, found in both cities of Documenta, that provided a wider framework for Belmore's work and meant that in this context she was not a token representative of indigeneity as she sometimes is in these large art fairs. Belmore's Athens piece was not the first work in which the artist incorporated tents to comment on homelessness. She previously created a hybrid video projection / performance project called Tent City that addressed poverty, the lack of affordable housing, and the aggressive dismantlement of Vancouver's tent city in Creekside Park. In the resultant video collage, however, the tents remained tents, occupied by their residents, not made out of lavish stone for the viewer to briefly inhabit. It was, in fact, this material translation upward from the low to the high, and the idea that viewers at Documenta might be able to voluntarily put themselves in the place of a refugee or a migrant that was the cause of scorn for so many critics. And there was, of course, Belmore is very conscious about this, the phenomenon, the sort of Instagram phenomenon of interactivity that so much contemporary art partakes of, that can lead to some some kind of very spectacularized photos of tourists kind of happily sitting in this tent to sort of briefly, possibly, parachute into the idea of the refugee status, people smiling, having fun. And I think, in fact, though one could argue that this wrests the tent away from an engagement with the haptic because it's so very mediated, I think Belmore was, in fact, quite conscious and critical of that spectacularization that she knew was going to happen, that it would be this kind of brief encounter staged for the photograph, and I think she wanted to activate a kind of critical apparatus about that phenomenon. Another work in Athens used a tent to refer to displaced persons, Emily Jasser's Memorial to 418 Palestinian villages which were destroyed, depopulated, and occupied by Israel in 1948 from 2000, an actual refugee tent made of cloth with the names of destroyed Palestinian villages stenciled onto it and then painstakingly embroidered with black thread by a team of nearly 150 volunteers. And Jasser has said that she made the title this long and explicit because she never wanted it to be ruptured from the content. She always wanted this tent to be cemented to this meaning, and she knew that if it was in the title, people couldn't divorce the violence of the act that she was memorializing. Shown in Kassel as part of an exchange with the Contemporary Art Museum collection in Athens, Jasser's piece differs from Belmore's in several respects and triggers different associations through its use of rough canvas instead of smooth marble. For one thing, Jasser's title refers to a historical event, violence against Palestinian ways of life occurring as a result of the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and her emphasis on the act of naming the villages further anchors the piece to a precise geography and moment in time. So for some people, the Belmore piece was too abstract and too removed from any specific crisis of statelessness or homelessness, whereas Jasser's is very, very precise in that way. And I will just say very quickly, I can't get too into this, but I did just publish a book about textile. Handmaking and Jasser's piece, to me, really interestingly fits into my argument about how textile making can be so collective in its enterprise, but also the fact that many of the people who came together to embroider this tent were learning to stitch in that moment. They were coming to it as untrained sewers. And I make an argument about how it's very important to acknowledge the fact that because we are surrounded by them at almost every moment of every day for our entire lives, we are all experts in textiles. And my book is very much about amateur making, but it's also about what I call an amateur method of thinking through and with textiles that is also, in my opinion, a kind of queer method of honoring alternative modes of knowledge. So as I said, Belmore's From Inside was seen as too broad in its apparently overly poetic evocation of the enormity of the refugee crisis. And its stylized or abstracted tent was not specific enough to be effectively legible or politically pointed. I'm also interested in the fact that I chose to write about this marble tent, which is obviously not cloth, but is in clear conversation with textility, you might call it. So how the marble itself is meant to represent textiles, even though it is not textiles. In addition, though it's possible to enter Jasser's tent, Belmore's structure in Athens was only truly operative if one sat down inside and looked out at the Acropolis in order to consider the disjunctions between the self-glorification of Western civilizations and the catastrophes it has wreaked. It did not just beckon this engagement from the viewer, it demanded it. Since only a couple of bodies could fit into the small space at any given time, it risked atomizing the experience, individualizing it. Another more generous way to phrase this is that Belmore's tent, with its compact physical scale, encouraged viewers to assume a sense of their own accountability, soliciting their individual touch. Fostering such personal encounters has often been a tactic of Belmore's practice. For instance, in A Gathering of People for Any Purpose, she arranged a circle of chairs in which viewers could sit and listen to the voices of Indigenous Canadian women in the artist's own close relational network. Ruth B. Phillips notes of this work, for Belmore, the interactive potential of the installation offered a positive strategy with which to address stereotyping, racism, and the prices paid by the victims of these evils. Chairs, with their seats, backs, and legs, function as surrogates for human bodies. Belmore proposes that these common objects of household furniture are as much the work's characters as are the recorded female voices. Much as new materialism sometimes claims a kind of innovation for itself only by suppressing native epistemologies, so-called relational aesthetics could also be understood to have deep precedence in indigenous artistic practices, as well as in feminist artistic practices. In her book, Indigenous Methodologies, Margaret Kovach writes, within indigenous discourse, there are aspects of indigenous epistemologies that consistently emerge. They are all bound by the relational. She goes on to elaborate that this relationship is not identified as a specific theme because it is wholly integrated in with everything else. Indigenous epistemologies live within a relational web, and all aspects of them must be understood from that vantage point. Indeed, Belmore's work weaves together a sensitivity to materiality and to the liveliness of matter with a relational approach, not least as she highlights relations between humans and relations between humans and the earth. These aspects of her work cannot be disentangled. In discussing her work Trace, a cascading blanket of handmade clay beads, she stated, quote, "It's this idea of thinking about the historic material that was taken from the ground and a conceptual level of revisiting this idea of human beings that have always used the earth to make objects that were functional to them, to us. So therefore, this work is about our human relationship to the land." Again, even before she creates the ceramic beads, Belmore insists that the clay itself tells of its connection to the earth, and her work consistently foregrounds the material relations between humans and objects. And I'm showing you this kind of process shot of her making these clay beads because I want you to see the texture here. The beads retain her grasping finger marks, and touch for me in my book Frey and in much of my other work, I talk about the tactile as a way especially to inscribe labor. That is a way, texture and the tactile for me is also a way to visibly retain the work that went into it, and this idea of texture comes in part from Eve Sedgwick's notion that when you touch something and it's rough or you feel its texture, one of the questions that you ask is, how was this made? So this idea that the haptic also is about demystifying or deveiling systems of handiwork and labor. Other projects, such as Speaking to Their Mother by Belmore, amplify First Nations voices in order to protest land grabs by the Canadian government. It is crucial to recognize that Belmore comes to the issue of displacement from the perspective of someone whose own communities have been structurally, brutally, and repeatedly displaced. How can art find adequate language to address the vast scale of forced migration and the complexities of its attendant urgencies around war, global climate change, asylum seeking, and debates about resettlement? In 2003, well before the current waves of refugees losing their lives trying to flee their home countries, Colombian artist Doris Salcedo created an installation in Istanbul, 1,550 chairs stacked between two buildings, to pay homage to the many populations pushed out by global capitalism, and to serve as a reminder that these processes have been going on for many decades. Like Belmore in A Gathering of People, she uses chairs here for their capacity to summon human bodies. As Salcedo explained in an interview, there were legacies of a violent past where Jews and Greeks were forced out of their buildings, these buildings. It's this process of a placement as well as a forceful displacement that's taking place. It was basically a multi-layer of events that's been taking place for over 50 years and a process that was very much alive. So this is also a kind of counter-monument, I would argue, the Salcedo. Referring to a more elusive gesture in favor of sharply underscoring the art world's overall lack of interest in acknowledging its own privileges and complicities, a guerrilla graffiti intervention at the 2011 Venice Biennale utilized stenciled arrows to point viewers to a then non-existent anonymous stateless migrants pavilion, which has since come in this last iteration actually had such a pavilion, but in the first kind of guerrilla instantiation, it was just pointing viewers to nowhere because such a pavilion did not exist. Other contemporary artists have come under fire for attempting, and in some accounts failing, to find adequate language for this crisis. For example, the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei has produced several works in which he has grappled with this issue and provoked varied reactions, from a much excoriated photograph of the artist reenacting a news picture of a drowned Syrian child face down on the shore of the Greek island of Lesbos, to an installation in which he wrapped the columns of Berlin's concert house with 14,000 bright orange life jackets. The criticisms that Belmore faced for her Documenta piece, especially for her decision to depict a lowly tent out of the exalted marble, highlights some of the fault lines around these debates. Rather than castigate her use of materials and from inside as excessive, we might instead grasp how Belmore's use of pale white marble has the potential to speak back to the racist formations that underpin a fear of migrants and the persecution of indigenous peoples as aberrant others within the container of the nation-state under the growing fascist political climate in many countries. For in fact, Belmore's conversion of the tent into a marble sculpture elevates it within the presumed hierarchies of Western fine art, dignifying it. Such an elevation caused it to be targeted by white supremacists, angered that her installation besmirched an ostensibly untainted classical past. Physically encased in a marble environment of literal whiteness that critically comments on whiteness as an ideological formation, Belmore's viewer might reflect upon the many occlusions in collective memory that have produced and policed a mistaken understanding of a whitewashed ancient past. For the marble of classical figures was vividly painted, with a wide variety of skin tones represented. As classicist Sarah Bond has asked, if we know these statues were polychrome, why do they remain lily white in our popular imagination? Drawing the ire of the alt-right who cannot tolerate any facts that contradict their hateful insistence on white supremacy, Bond argued in an online essay that ancient persons did not engage in the construct of biological racism and outlined her desire to abandon the Eurocentric art history of the 18th century and its championing of whiteness as equal to beauty. And Sarah Bond was trolled hard by white supremacists for publishing a very well-known fact, which was that these statues that we think of as white were not. They never were in their own time. Within this context, Belmore's choice of white marble reads as an incisive commentary on race, color, and erasure. Facing the Parthenon as it undergoes its seemingly perpetual, never-completed restoration, from inside with its gray streaks and surface imperfections, gestures to multiple temporalities, collisions between past, present, and future, evident in the stone itself. Thank you.
That was a perfect start to our day. Thank you so much, Julia. That was just a gorgeous summary of a range of works, but particularly Belmore's committed to thinking about this dynamic between the temporary and the permanent in particular. So I have a couple of questions, and then we'll see if we can begin our project of studying today. And I mean, one thing really stood out to me when you could see the images of people at Documenta going into the tent and taking selfies and pictures of themselves in the tent. It reminded me of the Carol Walker exhibit, A Subtlety, which was also one of these massive white structures commenting on white supremacy and on a long history of trade and so on. And so how can we think there about the visitor, you know, the actual visitor to the exhibit as somebody who begins to determine the meaning of the work? And, you know, does that enter into your reading?
Right. I mean, I think that so many of the criticisms that Belmore faced for this tent was precisely because of the festive environment that it seemed to generate around itself. And if not festive, then this idea of the temporary inhabitation of this very troubling shelter, you know, and this idea that you could really, for a second, I'm going to hop in this tent, I'm going to have my picture taken, you know, and then I'm going to exit and go back to my my life of ease and privilege, was deeply concerning for some people. But I do believe that, as with Walker, who knew very well that people would interact, you know, I think was very conscious of the fact that she was staging an environment in which people would self-indict, in a way, in which you are the, you know, when you put that picture up on Instagram, that you are saying something about your own desire there. It's not about what, I mean, it is partially about what the piece elicits, but it's so much about a complicated relationship between your own fantasies and your own moments of projection. For sure.
And it throws this question of insider, you know, it throws up inside as a question. What is from the inside? What does it mean to look from the inside?
Yeah, and I think the piece is very open-ended, and there were many, I'm sure, I mean, that the encounter was so, I think because the piece was, because it was so open-ended, it could be turned into so many different, turned to so many different ideological purposes. And it was, of course, possible to sit in that tent and reflect upon the fact that you are staring at the Parthenon, you know, and that you are in this, I mean, to just make the connections that she so explicitly wanted you to make by virtue of this sightline. At the same time, it was also very easy for you to totally ignore that and to focus on the person taking your picture, or to, you know, think about your selfie, etc. So I think that I think that some contemporary art comes under fire precisely when it doesn't provide a perfect script for how to respond to it. And I think, and to me, that seemed like where so many of the criticisms were coming from. It's like, this is so unspecified. You know, a marble tent. What does that have to do with homelessness? What does that have to do with the refugee crisis? It's too open. You know, it was seen as too metaphoric in a way.
When in fact, it's a meditation precisely on how difficult it is to make these moves. You know, to pick a tent up is not a simple thing.
Right.
And mobility for refugees is not this ease of movement. It's in fact an incredibly onerous thing to move.
Yeah.
And the tent clearly claims that. But also these critiques of it as grandiose are so crazy when you think of something like Richard Meyer's marble monstrosity, you know, the Getty, which is made of Greek marble also, that had to be moved to bloody Los Angeles, you know, whereas this is Greek marble commenting precisely upon Greece as the site both of a deep investment in classical antiquity, but also as the site of the most pressing refugee crisis of the contemporary moment.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the material choice was so canny, you know, and so interestingly related to so many different local circumstances, which did also have to do with, you know, extractivism of resources, etc., but for sure about the classical past. And it was, that was the material at hand. And I think that that's one of the things that Belmore is trying to point out. This wasn't an importation of some other
just for the purpose
stone,
of
exactly.
How amazing this is.
Right.
And one more question, and then we'll open it up. I also thought it was gutsy in a way of you to then make the juxtaposition, but incredibly pedagogically apt to Doris Salcedo's work. The chair monument was incredible in relationship to Belmore's work, precisely because immigration and indigeneity are in fact often in opposition, and so it's actually pretty interesting to put that and the gathering side by side via the metaphor of the chair, just because these are actually minoritarian forms that are actually in contestation with each other.
Yeah, I couldn't say it any better than that, but I think to me the idea of the bodily surrogate through domestic furniture that both Belmore and Salcedo are thinking through was really interesting to think about what it summons in its very absence, for sure.
Can we take some comments? Yes, all the way at the back, and we'll come to you with a microphone, and then Aaron.
Hi, my question was about the marble tent. So it's a little bit complex to phrase it, but I will do my best. For me, and my question is, if you also have the same perspective, it was a little bit of a failure, not from the artist's perspective, but like she already took in account our failure as viewers, that we would not meditate about it, or we would not consider what this is about, because living in a world where everything is like a hashtag far from our information, if we don't have this instant, like almost childish like information back towards us, then we don't reach it. And then there was this critique that it was too, as you said, Jack, it was too meditative. It was said that it was too deep, but then isn't it us as viewers failing to look at it? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I don't, I often try to resist a language of success or failure when it comes to artworks, just because those words are really contingent, and what yesterday's failure is today's grand success, and vice versa. And of course, every viewer is going to come to this work and have a different critical judgment. I think for myself, it's been a hugely generative piece to think alongside, not only because of my work in textiles and its interestingly oblique approach to textiles, but also because of how it proposes a conversation with the counter monument in the space of this very contested art fair, where the decision to have it be in two locations came under such fire. And for me, this is one of the this piece had a very thoughtful dialogue with its situatedness, both in Athens and then also in Kassel. So I think failure, success, I kind of want to talk around that in a way and just say, it definitely was not critically beloved. It definitely wasn't received with a lot of gushing praise in the moment of this past summer. This all just recently happened, of course. But it's my hope that with our conversation now, that we can understand that there were many layers of complexity that got lost, in the kind of rush to judge, which happened all over the place around Documenta. And a lot of the work got kind of lumped together, and there were many different interventions and many different kinds of things that were happening. And to me, it's really important to give them their own, frame.
And as you said, many different forms of conjuring of the indigenous that Documenta, including the Sami. The Sami presence was really distinct there, wasn't it? And we can maybe ask Paul about this later.
Yeah.
Aaron.
Thank you so much. It's such a relief to have a paper that's that thoughtful on Rebecca Belmore's work. And a couple of thoughts, and maybe there's a question in the midst of it. My own work my own artwork is textiles, so I feel very strongly the necessity for a voice like yours and for your work. And it strikes me that I just give you a little bit of my own experience. I was in the Sydney Biennale some years ago, where most of the work on the Cockatoo Island was textile, and it was very, very clear the gendering in the critics, right? I mean, as soon as you were doing textile, you were both necessarily doing domestic work, and you were a woman, and you were generally, even though we weren't all women, but most of us were, but you were generally accused of not being contemporary enough because your labor was too clear, or of not being good enough because your labor wasn't clear enough. I mean, it's, so the question of labor domesticity in relation to textile is really strong, and we know we have this history in textile where the few men who are known for their textile work in the early period were allowed to be monumental, right? Where the women are always reduced to their work and to their domesticity. And so I think in one way, Rebecca Belmore simply fucked with that. I mean, she really played it differently. And it is my experience that the Biennale or the art fair model creates a kind of Instagram presence, which I would put less on the bodies of the viewers than on the organization of the art market as the place to create that kind of spectacular orientation. I can't tell you how many people in that context come in with their iPhone before they come in with their eyes. I mean, it's remarkable how many people look through their phones. And it's destabilizing as an artist because it's odd, right? But it's led me to think a lot about what the ways might be as artists and as people who are sensitive to art to facilitate other ways of viewing and feeling, maybe like these kinds of events we're having right now. And then the other thought I had was also in link to yesterday, you might have some things to say about that in relation to being didactic. And this incredible pressure, which may not be as clear to people who aren't making art, to represent the political. It's so strong. And so what she does is refuses to do that. She won't play the representation. It's the role that the indigenous voice has been placed in. The only relevant artistic indigenous voice is the one that represents indigeneity in the ways that are already understood by the settler. And she won't do that. And I think that she's penalized for that as well, for remaining open-ended. And I don't know if you have thoughts about that, but I think of your work with Cecilia Vicuña. Also, Cecilia has always refused to do that. She won't play that card. And I think textile artists have a history of refusing to play that card. And anyway, I just appreciated your work.
Yeah, I think we're out of time, and I'm not sure I have much. Those were beautiful. There's more comments.
Do you want to take 2 more comments and then just make a conclusion?
Sure,
remark?
Absolutely. I mean, thank you. I just want to say thank you to Erin for all those very, very thoughtful and comments and reflections. I really appreciate that.
And we'll come back to you, Erin. And we're just going to take 2 very short comments, if you don't mind. One with the mic and then up here.
Yeah, thank you for that. I missed the very first part. But I think there's something interesting going on here. Also with, I'm seeing some connection between the idea of touch and authenticity and orientation. That in the sense, if the political is really about a space of orientation and decision, to really try to reduce it. Rebecca seems to put us into a place where we're loaded with so many markers for how we could possibly locate ourselves and so many decisions for where we can move. And that's what makes it both a very tense space because we want clear directions. That's why the rise of right-wing populism is so strong right now. They offer like a very clear direction. This is where we need to go, And when an artist puts forward an orientation where we're left to think about where we want to go and where we can go, we experience, some of us experience some crisis, but for artists that's actually a kind of crisis we want to to create. So just to go to authenticity.
Can I ask you to finish up, please, just so we can have one more comment?
So just authenticity and touch. I'm wondering, you know, what's truth to material? What's an authentic cultural engagement? Something along those lines.
Perfect. Okay, and the last comment, and then Julia will wrap up everything neatly, as she does.
Yes, thank you for the talk, and thank you for bringing up the Jochen and Esther Gertz monument in relation to Rebecca Belmore, which I found really interesting. Also in relation to violence, because we talked about this connection of the tactile or touch and violence, and this monument is about guilt and talking about violence. And yeah, I just wanted to ask you to comment on the relation again, but I don't know if there's enough time.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, all of these. Thank you so much to everyone who just commented and spoke. I think absolutely ambiguity creates tension. So I really appreciate what you just said, and it does tie back to what Aaron was saying about the pressure to be didactic or to be clear. You know, what is your intervention? How are you making? You know, what? Say it. Just don't be vaporous in a way. And I think that the Belmore tent suffered because of its ambiguity. I think it also really is so productive because of its ambiguity. You know, and to me, it opens into so many other questions, precisely about the domestic, women's work, monumentality, whiteness, ideological constructions of the classical past, et cetera, and also to violence and inscription. And I think the Gertz's, I mean, that monument, of course, it's both a monument and a memorial, such an important intervention in public space, and one that admits all of these monuments, memorials, they will only ever do temporary work, you know? They will, I mean, we can never do enough to pay homage to these ruptures in our recent histories, and they will become invisible, and it actualized that. But I think so I wanted to put Belmore in conversation with that project, not only because I think that her work was kind of critically overlooked in a way, or it acted its own disappearance, but also because of the engagement with touch, with the stylus, you actually got to literally impress some, your writing onto the surface. And of course, what that ended up looking like was just a bunch of scribbles, because people aren't always very thoughtful in those moments of engaging as much as artists want them to be. So yeah, I think, so I just appreciate all of the reflections here, and I think we're out of time.
Thank you so much, Julia.
Mm-hmm.